Hey, SpaceWatchers, this is Space Café Radio, your channel about trends, awesome events, and interesting people in the space sector. This episode is the second block of 3 in that workshop organized by Professor Leslie Jane Smith and Dr. Ingo Baumann. In this episode, you will hear from Dr. Matthias Kreit from Kreit Law, from Antonia Zorich, Munich Re, from Cécile Gobert of Exotrail, and Catherine Dolderina of The Orbit. I'm Thorsten Kriening, publisher at SpaceWatch.Global, and I had the honor to moderate through this event. Sit back and enjoy the wonderful world of space law. Our second session will focus on startups, and they are, as we all know, a vibrant and very essential part of the space ecosystem. I try to avoid new space or to use too often. But we will explore key topics like export control, insurance, contracting here in that case, and sustainability from their very unique perspectives. And that's very interesting to hear. And we will start with Matthias to talk about critical insights on export controls and their implication for startups. Exciting start. Welcome.
Maybe I'm the first one to stay into the 10 minutes. I will try hard, but as Oliver already mentioned, as a lawyer, you're used to being paid for the time you're talking. Also, this is, of course, a topic where I normally talk hours about it. And here I roughly summarize it for the 10-minute speech here. Very warm welcome from my side. Thank you very much to Jane and Ingo for having me invited and to talk here. Since I only have 10 minutes, I will just go ahead and start. What will I be talking to you about? Export controls for startups. Why does it matter? Why is that so important, so relevant for startups? What are the key regulations you have to face and challenges which come with the regulations? And of course, strategies how to deal with it. For a lot of people, export controls is as much liked as the weather which we have currently outside. Nevertheless, especially when you're in the aerospace sector, it's a very important topic you cannot ignore. Why does it matter at all? Why is this an important topic? Of course, because it's about security, safeguard national securities, prevent proliferation of sensitive technologies. We have dual-use items, we have military items. We need to control them because a lot of countries, a lot of people want to have those technologies, those items. And especially as we will see in the space sector, we are dealing with these items, which are controlled for good reasons. And then, of course, we have the international obligations. We have, for example, the Missile Technology Control Regime, the MTCR, which we have to comply with. Why are export controls so relevant for startup companies? First of all, it's important to know that export controls are not just commodities, but also technologies and also software. And especially in the past years, we see it more and more that software becomes an issue and is controlled for a lot of companies, not just in the aerospace sector, but especially also when you're dealing with aerospace applications, with space applications and systems. Examples of controlled systems, of course, the items like launchers, launch vehicles, propulsion systems, satellites, the software to that, encryption with a lot of times comes with a software which is highly controlled, and of course the technical know-how to develop such items. All that is controlled, export controlled. It does not mean that you cannot export it, but of course it means you need to have a license in place and an authorization to basically send it over to cross-border transactions. Why is export controls a topic which is so important for startups in the space sector? I just mentioned that due to the nature of the space sector, of the items which are being developed, this is all about, of course, you're almost always somewhere in some area which will be controlled. So you have to deal with those regulations. Basically, it's rockets and rules, you could say, or satellite and sanctions or something like that. Also, a lot of startups, a lot of new business ideas, a lot of use cases we find are using emerging technologies, which may not be controlled today, which may be controlled tomorrow, or which are already controlled. But a lot of robotic applications, we see the use of AI, of course. And with this, there's also strong interest from the military. So we see a lot of startups which have military contracts in place from the very beginning, because this is very interesting for the military a lot of. Also, of course, non-compliance can lead to severe penalties, even criminal charges. So you can ignore this issue because it will impact your business if you have violations in a larger scale. One other thing is, which a lot of startups realize once they are pitching and they have investors from the traditional sectors, those investors insist on compliance programs to be implemented in these companies, even at early stages, because they want to make sure that if their money goes to some startup company, that this startup company will not violate the laws and regulations and also will not face any penalties and will not have any bad reputation. So this is also something startups face or have to face, that the investors have some expectations in this regard. So what are the key regulations startups have to deal with? So let's highlight some of those frameworks. Of course, we have the European Union with a dual-use regulation. This is the regulation, the directive for dual-use items which can be used military and civil. There's a long list of items which are considered to be dual-use items. Then we have the EU sanctions. And of course, in addition, when you're a European member state, you have to follow your own national law. When it comes to military items, this is still regulated on a purely national level. So that means you also have to deal with the national law of the country of the member state you're in. On the other hand, there are the US laws and regulations, which probably is not surprising to anyone here in the room, but they have some extraterritorial application. And therefore, once you have a nexus to the US, which could be technology or could be the use of items or could be components you have in your non-US item, or if you have developed your non-US item with certain US technology or US software, for example, you may have this nexus. Same for the sanctions, of course. The US has some blacklists from different authorities. And if you have a business partner, let's say a Chinese university maybe, which is on such a list, and you have the nexus to the US, which could be in a lot of ways, as I just mentioned, then you're under the jurisdiction of these regulations and you have to follow them. Basically, this is the so-called ITAR. That's a term a lot of people know and fear because it's a set of regulations which is very strict. International Traffic in Arms Regulation, that's about defense items, defense articles and technology. Then the EAR, the Export Administration Regulation, which basically cover all other items of US origin or where there's a certain relevant US content. And then in addition, there are the so-called OFAC regulations, which are basically the financial sanctions of. So this comes on top of the European regulations. What are the challenges in particular? One challenge I already mentioned, that when you're as a startup in a very early phase where you have a lot of issues and a lot of challenges to deal with, you also have the burden of export controls. So there are a lot of times you don't have the expertise you need. You don't have the resources yet, maybe not even the budget if you have not managed to have investors on board. On the other hand, there's a lot of technology transfer. We see that with a lot of startups that they have offices, not just in Germany, but also maybe in France, in Spain, sometimes even in Switzerland, in a third country outside the EU. So you have a lot of technology transfer from the very beginning. Also, what we see is startups are very agile. They look for the best people. So they hire people basically all over the world. We've seen that because they need engineers. They need the best engineers. If they can't find them in Europe, they come from somewhere else. That means you have a very international staff of people. And when you have US technology involved, and they have access within your company to that technology, that could be a so-called deemed re-export. So it's basically a re-export of US technology within your company, which could be subject to a license, to an authorization. Also, we have a very outdated definition of what is an export. It's the making available of technology outside your country if it's in regard to military, or outside of the EU if you have dual-use items. So when you have somebody working for your company and this person is outside, let's say lives in Switzerland and can access the server with the dual-use technology on it, that's considered to be an export where you need to have a license. So it's very tricky. This technology transfer is a huge issue. And of course, it goes with the cross-border collaborations that a lot of startups seek corporations, not just in one country, but it's very international business. And of course, it's fast-paced innovations we're talking about. And sometimes startups are even faster than the law can develop. And a lot of times they need licenses faster than at least the German BAFA is able to grant. So these are just some typical challenges, strategies to deal with. I want to keep this short. Mainly be aware, have training and education of your people, and have an ICP, an internal compliance program implemented in your company. That's key. That's what you need from the very beginning if you're dealing with space. Having said this, that's it. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions.
Matthias, you'll forgive me for asking 2 questions in one, and it's not really a startup question. There is a principle in European law that European rules don't apply to the European Union, like it's a sovereign state. So we've got these fantastic export regulations that we all know. We've got Galileo satellites that are going out to be launched by our dear friend. There's agency non-controlled exports, facilitated exports. ESA, EU SPA could export to USA, no problem, particularly with Galileo satellites. Have you any idea how they're going to have a look at that? You don't need to answer it now if it's too much.
Let me just say that there are, of course, always issues when you have a public partner like ESA, for example, who concentrates solely on being compliant with US export controls and doesn't really care too much about EU regulations. And when you then have involved the private sector, because for them, they have to be compliant with those regulations. And this is what we see a lot when you're dealing with public entities who interpret sometimes the law different. Sometimes they just say, we're not under this jurisdiction. So it is complicated.
I mean, it could well be that the question's for Frank. If you're exporting the Galileo satellites to the USA, are you going to do interagency, or are you going to ask the manufacturer to apply for the export license? Food for thought, and I'm quite happy if you want to answer it at a later stage, but I was just thinking we're about to practice all of these things in a very short space of time.
Yeah, and you have a lot of issues there. For example, if you have a data room and you upload something into the ESA data room, and then there's a company from outside the EU also accessing this room because it's part of a program. We had that years ago with Russia, for example, or with maybe Canada, the US, or whatever. And if this company knows already that ESA will grant access to a party outside the EU, then who's liable?
Thank you very much. Next one will be Antonia Zoric from Munich Re, who will not talk about insurance directly, if I understood it right.
Thank you very much. So also warm welcome from my side. I'm Antonia Zoric from Munich Re, one of the leading space insurance companies globally. And welcome to this presentation about space insurance basics, some insights for startups. All right. So I only have 10 minutes. I will directly jump into today's agenda. So after first introduction of the space team, I will describe the main risk phases which are relevant in space insurance and their corresponding risk factors. And we will end the presentation with some principles of space insurance. So let's start with my team. So we have a multidisciplinary team which sit in Munich. Our leading expert, Achim Enzian. Then we have 2 senior underwriters, Hendrik Baumann and Christopher Burkhardt. Hendrik is our lawyer, and Christopher also has a background in engineering and is our expert for in-orbit space servicing. And our newest team member, Friedrich, who joined us 2 years ago after his aerospace studies. And also myself, I'm an innovation consultant in both the aviation and space team in Munich Re, responsible for all business development, all things that go beyond the classical insurance topics, digitization, for example. And also I act as a first contact person for startups. And now it gets exciting. We will talk about the relevant risk phases for you as a space company. And Munich Re insures your satellite from the transport until the nominal operations. And now we will have a look at each of these phases, what activities we have there and what can go wrong. So let's start with the transportation phase. As you, as a space company, build your satellite, you might want to launch it into orbit as soon as possible. The start of this phase is your satellite leaving the manufacturing site with your desired transport vehicle, and it ends with arriving at the launch site. And so the satellite is conveyed, for example, via car or usually via plane, truck or ship. All different vehicles are possible here. And what is important, it is usually protected in a special container where the satellite is properly fastened. However, physical damage can always happen. For example, if you have turbulences in case of an aeroplane or bumpy roads. And so Munich Re insures your satellite against physical damage. What is also important to know in this phase, the satellite can be repaired if something happens. And maybe from your car insurance, a small deductible is required, a small fee, which you have to pay in the case of a loss, and all above is covered by Munich Re. So it's a typical insurance. You can compare it also with your car insurance. It's the same principle. Usually the transport phase requires a combined policy with the pre-launch and launch phase. There are other phases, for example, the launch phase, which can be bought just as a launch vehicle flight only, but we will talk about this later. But what else can go wrong? It's worth to mention that usually the satellites are conveyed via plane, and you have this container which could open in case of some unexpected turbulences, for example. As I work also in the aviation team, I know that, for example, clear air turbulences are very unexpected, and with global warming are happening more. And this container, if it opens, this can lead either to a partial or total loss of the satellite. And so main risk factors here are especially the type of transport vehicle. It can also be a car, for example, in case of small CubeSats. So here we also see cases that the satellites are really transported in the back of the car, which earlier was not so usual. And there the transporting distance, of course, plays a huge role, and also the container type. Let us move on to one of the most critical phases on the ground, the pre-launch phase. This phase starts as soon as the satellite arrives at the launch state and ends when we have the liftoff or the intentional ignition of the rocket if something goes wrong. And what are activities here? So the satellites are unboxed and tested on the ground, and this is done by the launch service provider and also by the satellite company. And here we have significant differences between the launch sites that are relevant for our insurance. If you have a very experienced launch site, they have more history and more experience in all the safety measures and all the procedures in comparison with a very new launch site. And this also will reflect in the premium we will charge for this insurance. Again, the physical damages, for example, covered here, and deductible is required. Let's now have a look again what can go wrong. Many things that could happen here, but most typical is an accident during satellite handling, so that the satellite can possibly tip over. Or what is also quite common is that major errors are found during the pre-launch phase, which were never found before when you were at the manufacturing site. And it's not uncommon that repairing the satellite is not possible at the launch site. So in this case, a consequence would be to transporting the satellite back to the manufacturer. And this would then also delay the launch. And the main risk factors here are, for example, the size, the mass of the satellite, which is especially important in the case if the satellite would tip over, and then different activities at the launch site, if you do have static fire tests or not, can increase the risk. Let us move on with the riskiest phase of them all, the launch phase. And this is a very exciting phase for you as a space manufacturing company, as here you have to rely on the launch provider. So this phase, everything is controlled by the launch service provider, and it's not anymore in your hands. So it's a very exciting phase, which starts at the liftoff or at the intentional ignition of the rocket and ends with the separation of the satellite. And here we also cover again the material damage or malfunctions, and this is often combined with other risk phases. However, the launch vehicle flight only can also be bought as a single product. Let us have a look again what can go wrong here. The most prominent and also the loudest example for sure is the explosion of a rocket. I think all of us have seen plenty of videos of that, or some of us maybe were lucky enough to be on site and live at one of the launches, not sure. I wasn't so far, and so this is really the most prominent example what can happen. And here the corresponding risk factor is definitely the quality of the launch vehicle. So as an insurance company, we're having a look at the failure probabilities, and there can be significant differences. For example, a proven SpaceX Falcon 9 has probability of failure under 3%. And if you have a completely new vehicle, then it can go up to 20%. So this will also reflect in the price in the end. So everything has to work as planned so that your satellite finally gets into the intended orbit. And after the launch, it is followed by the post-separation and the in-orbit phase. We combined those two phases, which also are the last phases, as they have very similar activities and also risk factors that are relevant here. And the post-separation starts directly with the separation of the satellite and ends with the customer handover, or the so-called beep. So when you have the operation starting, and this can take several months depending on the complexity. of the post-separation phase. And then after this customer handover, the real servicing of the satellite can start, and we are in the in-orbit phase, which will lead until the end of life, which is the phase end here. And so typical for the in-orbit phase for the bigger commercial geosatellites is that they are built to last at least 15 years in orbit. But for the insurance specifics, I have to mention here that the policies that we have here are renewed on an annual basis, where we have a look at the technical components, the health status of the satellite. So even if it's a longer period, we renew those policies year by year. And again, let us have a look what can go wrong. And I will be quick. Not only the lawyers have problems with the 10 minutes. And for the post-separation, what is typical here, that some components are unfunctional when you're in the real space environment. Some tests couldn't really be replicated from the manufacturer. This could lead, in the worst case, to the death of the satellite. And some factors can happen in both the post-separation and the operations phase, which are collisions, either with space debris or with another satellite. So most risk factors here touch the system architecture, so technical aspects, but also third-party aspects can play a role, like the collisions. And last but not least, I will present some principles. So how is the general insurance set up when you as a space company are seeking to buy insurance? So as a satellite owner or launching company, you will normally contact a broker, which is specialized in the new space or in the general space industry. And the broker is the intermediary between the space company and the space insurers, who collects all the requirements from the stakeholders so that the space insurers, which will be Munich Re, for example, can do their risk assessment. And we speak about very high sum insureds here, and that's why we have two effects. We as a space insurer and also our competitors are not likely to be the only one that will take this risk, because it's a very high sum insured. And also you as a space company maybe do not want to rely on just one insurance company, because it could potentially go bankrupt. And the broker collects capacity in the market from a so-called insurance panel. It's a bigger insurance panel, definitely for the geosatellites, where we have the higher sum insureds. And it can also be for LEO up to 3 insurers. With a little bit lower sum insureds, it can also be one insurer, but the most common case is that this risk is divided between some insurance companies. And if you remember one thing about today's presentation, then let it be this: for you as a space company, it's not too early to think about insurance for your mission, especially if you want to buy in-orbit insurance. Then, as you have seen, there are many technical aspects that play a role here. For example, the business and mission description, definitely the timeline and milestones, and the technical product information. For launch insurance, it's a bit easier, but if you want to buy in-orbit insurance, that we need a lot of data. And then I asked also my colleagues from underwriting, what is a good time frame when you should contact us for in-orbit insurance? And they said it's at least 1 year prior to your mission start. So it's good to keep in mind also for your investors to think early about insurance. That's it. Thank you very much.
Next one will be Cécile Goubert from Exotrail, and she will share the startup's perspective on space debris mitigation.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Jane Ingo, for inviting me to present you the space debris mitigation from the perspective of a startup, and how a startup can be active in this debris mitigation, and also what are our issues today. So I will open a lot of questions, won't give any answer. I am a lawyer. A few introductory words on Exotrail, which is a French company that was founded in 2017, so 7 years old now. And it was funded with the aim to offer in-space mobility solutions with objective. The first one being to make space more efficient, and the second one to impose long-term space sustainability. And our vision focuses on mobility in space with a prism based on 3 segments for space infrastructure. The first segment being deployment in space, deployment of satellites in space in addition to launcher. The second segment relates to in-orbit operation, and especially we are tackling here the issue of mobility, being able to maneuver a satellite in space. As we all know that the lifespan of a satellite is measured by its ability to move in space, especially when there is a threat of collision. And the third segment is end of life, and the management of end of life of a satellite is crucial in order to limit the generation of debris. So what have we done? We have been using an iterative process, meaning that we have developed internally several products, being hardware, software, and services, in order to provide this mobility solution. So we are developing for hardware, we are developing and manufacturing and selling all-effect electric engines, thrusters, to permit satellite to move in space and to avoid collision if necessary. We are also developing softwares, mission satellite design software and operation in orbit software that we are using internally for our own needs. And the third product, which is not a product, this is a service, which is associated to our OTV, Orbit Transfer Vehicle, which is called the Space Van. And this is a service to inject satellite or deliver satellite in orbit after the launch. 11th November 2023, we launched our first OTV, so we became a space operator. So you can see that our team was very happy. We launched it on the Falcon 9 SpaceX, so that was our first satellite. Then the satellite was separated from the launcher successfully, and after a few months, we delivered in orbit a satellite, ExoZero, our satellite, successful liberation as well. And here you can see that we fired our thrusters. So you have with this video all what we did, all of our product, service, delivery, engines. You saw the firing of the thruster, and of course this space van was operated with our in-orbit software. We strongly believe in ExoTrail that our mobility solution will provide for an efficient and sustainable space. But in this context, of course, as a lawyer, ask ourselves, what is the framework for such activities? Here, I have a lot of questions, so I will not ask all my questions. You all know there is a legal framework at the international level with the treaties, with the convention, etc. There are also some national space regulation. That is true. However, there are still some gray zones remaining, such as space traffic management, of course, where we don't have yet clear rules. The issue of debris mitigation and remediation, both of them is also at stake, although there are some guidelines, rules that do exist, but they are not mandatory. And although there are some national space regulation that do include such guidelines in their regulation, and as a French operator, we are ruled by one of the most constrained regulation in the world for this topic of debris mitigation, which is obviously the French Space Act. But we strongly believe that we need a consensus on this topic, not only at national level, but also at international level. So we all are on the same base, all operators, obviously. So we believe that a tailor-made regulation is needed, a regulation that should be clear, unambiguous, and above all, I am a private operator, okay? And above all, that should secure competitivity of the operators. So when talking about space sustainability and debris mitigation, we believe that mobility is the right solution, one aspect of the solution. It is the right one, and especially to tackle space debris generation. Indeed, today we are in a current situation where there are something like 10,000 satellites in orbit and more than 36,000 pieces of debris in space. So it means that it is important here today to tackle the issue of mitigation and remediation. I just want to say a few words on the amendments that have been made in France. Amendment to the Technical Regulation Decree, which entered into force the 20th of June 2024. So it's a pretty recent one, which has added some technical requirements regarding the limitation of debris generating and some more constraint regarding the end of life of a satellite, and especially the time frame where a satellite has to into either deorbited or coming into re-entry into the atmosphere within, let's say, a minimum of 3 years. It's a bit more complicated, but it should be a minimum of 3 years. As an operator of service, in-orbit services, in fact, requires a real coordination and cooperation between agencies and operators and the institutional entities. It is really important today regarding the fact that we are now maneuvering in space, that we are moving in space, to be able to coordinate, to cooperate between the operators. Because today we don't have the framework for that. And at ExoTrail, we call for a strong partnership with all the stakeholders to be able to share data about their in-orbit positioning and to coordinate in case of threat of collision. So this is our call, and we hope that the ITU will tackle this subject quickly. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Cecile. Do we have a question?
Super. Just very briefly on the new regulation on penalties that came into play. As far as I know, you were talking about June 24. Is that right? That the French operators can be fined quite a lot of money for non-compliance. What can they be fined for under the new regulation? Because it's a real penalty, isn't it? True. But is it for creating debris or is it non-compliance?
No, it's for non-compliance with the provision of the authorization, because you have some conditions that are imposed when you receive the authorization. And if you don't follow those conditions, then you might be fined. Yes.
Not that per se debris related, no. Or lifetime. Okay, super. Thank you.
Cecile, just to follow up on that question, does that mean then the authorities in France from the CNES are going to be a lot more strict in the continuous supervision?
Okay, so the authority, in fact, is the French ministry, and the CNES is the advisor and that makes the control. But anyway, yes, before, when you're asking or requesting an authorization, then the condition and the technical requirements are much more constrained.
Than before?
Yeah, than before. Yeah.
And then I'm assuming there is a strict continuous supervision.
Yes.
If they are going to be imposing strict assignments.
Yes. And anyway, under the French regulation, we have an obligation to inform CNES of any event that would jeopardize our activity. Anyway, there is a continuous supervision, that's right, but we are also obliged to inform of any non-compliance or any event.
Thank you very much, Cecile, again. And the fourth speaker for our second panel is Dr. Catherine Dolderina from the Orbit, and she will talk or discuss the topic of space contracting across jurisdictions, offering lesson learned from a startup.
Thank you, Torsten. So as Torsten said, I work as the general counsel in the Orbit, and we are a space logistics company. So we launch our taxi satellites that are similar to what Cecile and her team are doing, and we've been doing it for over 4 years and now have a fleet of taxi satellites in space in LEO, launching more and moving also into in-orbit servicing, hopefully in around 2028, and rolling out our in-orbit servicing offerings on the market. And these 4 years, slightly more of active space operations in dispersing satellites that are our passengers in precise orbital slots, and also testing technology of our other customers that remain as hosted payload in the bus of each ION satellite carrier, has given also me as the general counsel quite a good overview of what are the implications for a space logistics company in terms of contracting with especially other commercial customers in order to deliver our services, and how the jurisdictional and regulatory differences in various countries may play out and also impact the contractual arrangements between or among the parties, and also the delivery of the service itself. And I just want to start off giving you a context which will be, of course, familiar to all of you, and that it's the space activities are global, both from the perspective of the fact that most of the companies, both on the supply chain, but also their customers, do not operate in one jurisdiction. So they often depend within the supply chain from companies that are even not from the same geographical region. And same is for the customers who may be from any corner of the world. And for the orbit, this has been the case so far. And I think we only haven't launched a satellite from anybody in Africa. But other than that, we have covered and we have serviced companies and entities from all other continents. Not every country on the continent, but hopefully we'll come to that too. And another very important aspect, and I will not go into details because Matthias already introduced you, the dual-use technology that is so common to so many underlying technology and solutions within the space sector. But this obviously also needs to be confronted on the contractual level, for instance, as to how you can deal with certain technology to minimize its dual-use nature on your operations. And as a practical example, for instance, I can bring up the separation ring, the ring by which the satellite is attached to the rocket. And very often it is a dual-use technology. So how do you simplify also via the contract your operations with the separation ring so that you do not get into all the hurdles of exporting, importing, re-importing, etc. Very often you can arrange the integration at the launch site. And you buy the separation ring that is produced by a company that is a national of that jurisdiction. So you avoid, and you foresee this in the contract, and because of that, you also modify or impose certain conditions to your logistics in terms of how and where you ship and where your customer ships, for example, their satellites or their payload for integration, so that you simplify as much as possible the handling of any dual-use items that your mission may involve. The next item is the launch sites. So they're very limited. Today, for commercial purposes, we literally have only one, right? So everybody has to launch from the States. And this is a reality. And the reality is that every launch site is regulated. And the regulation that is imposed on the launch provider impacts how missions of foreign customers are carried out. And in the case of the orbit, because we are an integrator and we are an interface between the launch provider and our own customers that are aboard of our spacecraft vehicles, we need to make sure that any of the most critical and regulatorily imposed requirements that the launch provider needs to meet are flown down in the contracts with our customers. And in terms of some practical examples, I will use the two current business lines of the orbit. One is the transportation. So that's the part where we get our satellite passengers inside of ION. And then once ION is in orbit, we disperse them in precise orbital slots. And the second line is the provision of so-called advanced services. So this is a testing service for payloads that remain on board of ION and never leave it and are never introduced separately into outer space. So they remain inside the body of ION, and then when ION is deorbiting, they burn together with the spacecraft. So the example is space debris and space debris mitigation plan. We now, when we launch from the US soil, are obligated to respect the 5-year deorbiting period. And in two cases of transportation and advanced services, we deal also on the contractual level differently in terms of how we show compliance with this rule and how we properly flow it down. So for transportation, because we speak of satellites that actually leave ION and then they have an independent life afterwards in orbit, what we need to do is to make sure that the operators or owners of such satellites, they declare their compliance with such a rule. So the responsibility rests with the customer in terms of whether or not they are compliant, and we play the messenger who delivers the declaration to the launch provider. But in case where we host the payloads, so they never leave Ion, what is often requested from us for the purposes of compliance is that the nation of the customer whose payload is to be integrated and launched inside of Ion, they ask the authorities, ask their customers to reach out to us and put us in contact with such authorities so that we can provide sufficient evidence that Ion itself, so our spacecraft, is compliant, for example, with the 5-year deorbiting rule. And here you see the responsibility shifts because obviously the payload provider, given that they have no bus, and we give them the bus, they cannot say we are responsible for this. So here the contractual relationship becomes different. And to summarize, based on just these two examples, how important it is to assess what the underlying activity is and how then it can play out on what the contractual framework for executing this activity would then be. And impacts can be quite serious. Just to conclude and follow stance of Cecile, I want to propose some questions and food for thought in terms of how the contracts that underlie space activities will get more complex with the complexity of space activities that is growing currently. And the example is in-orbit servicing, right? How do you contractually cater for the process of preparing for the mission, the adjustment of the spacecraft, the servicer, the information that is exchanged between the customer and the service provider? How do you confront the phase of two spacecraft mated and operating while being one? How this should be addressed from the contractual perspective, taking into account any eventual regulatory requirements that will apply either to the service provider or the service spacecraft owner or operator, or both, and if these requirements for both will be the same or not, and the allocation of risk, both for inter-party damage that may be caused during the mission, but also third-party liability, right? What happens if the mated spacecraft hits something else, right? And how this can be catered for in the contractual terms. And this is obviously an exciting road ahead of us to define things like that and approach them in a sustainable and fair way so that the industry and the ecosystem moves forward successfully with more complex but also more sustainable space activities.
Thank you very much. Any questions?
In case of non-compliance with the orbiting obligations after 5 years, could the hosted payload be held directly liable by the FCC or always the spacecraft operator?
From the practical experience that we've had so far, the compliance lies with the technical characteristics of the spacecraft, of the bus. So the deorbiting responsibility cannot be assigned to the payload owner because the payload is integrated into somebody else's bus or spacecraft.
Yes, but you mentioned that they have to demonstrate that they will comply. So I was just wondering whether they have an obligation also to deorbit, although the liability or the responsibility should lie with the spacecraft operator, not with the payload.
Payload owner has no influence on the operation of the entire spacecraft. Also, just from the perspective of the service provider, the preference would be that the responsibility lies with the service provider, because otherwise you would need to give the reins of operating the spacecraft at the end of life to a hosted payload owner, which is a little complicated.
That concludes the second episode of the Space Law mini-series from the Space Tech Expo 2024 in Bremen. Stay tuned for the final episode. And if you have further questions, reach out to us at radio@SpaceWatch.Global. If you like these or other episodes of Space Café Radio, leave us a rating on your preferred podcast platform. It is the currency of today. And if you want to stay on the pulse of the space industry, please visit our website at www.SpaceWatch.Global and subscribe to our newsletters. And of course, don't forget to become a Space Watcher. I'm Thorsten Kriening, publisher at SpaceWatch.Global, your independent perspective on space.